Hello and welcome to tonight's talk with David Shouesmith, our chairman, talking about logistics in Afghanistan. We're very grateful to Beard Construction for sponsoring tonight's talk, and as always, at the end of the talk, there is a live Q&A hosted by Henry Spielberg, one of our trustees. If you are able to donate at any point this evening, we would be very grateful because, as you know, it's only with the donations that we're able to continue with the online talks, but also to support the ongoing work of the museum. This year is our 10th anniversary and there are lots of new events and exhibitions planned, not least a behind-the-scenes archive tour on March 23rd. You can book tickets for this on the website. I hope you enjoy this evening and we look forward to seeing you in the museum during 2024.
Good evening, I am Mark Beard, Chairman of Beard Construction, long-time resident and former High Sheriff of Oxfordshire. Beard Construction is delighted to support the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum this evening. Over our 13 decades, we've been privileged to have been a contractor to the British Army and other parts of the UK Defence Force. Numerous Beard staff have fought in 2 world wars and more recently formed part of our National Reserve Force. During this time we've been proud to have been a small cog in a military force recognised for its professionalism throughout the world. I hope you thoroughly enjoy this evening's talk.
Good evening and welcome to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. I'm David Innes, a trustee at the museum, and I'm delighted this evening to be joined by David Shouesmith, a Major General, retired Major General, formerly a Royal Logistic Corps officer, who is eminently qualified to talk about the logistical story of Afghanistan. And I think we'll come to you now, David, straight away to say, how did you come to get involved in the story in Afghanistan?
Thanks, David. And I should say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this subject, which has dominated the later part of my career in the military. Yeah. I was involved heavily on 2 phases of the Afghan operation. The first one was the initial deployment into Kabul, with General John McCall and Headquarters 3 Division, and that was over Christmas, New Year, 2001, 2002. And then my second involvement was as a senior officer in the MOD. I was Assistant Chief of Staff for Logistic Operations, and I was responsible for the totality of support to, in fact, all operations at the time, but particularly during the phase where we expanded from Kabul down to Helmand. So those were my two particular eras, if you like, when I was heavily involved in the logistics of this. And the first one was setting up the logistics for a brand new operation in a location 1,100 kilometres from the nearest seaport. And the second one was a very ambitious military expansion down into Helmand province.
These names, of course, are now part of our national language in a way. Can you tell us, please, how the logistic plan was how the logistic support was planned for these operations? Because the strength of the forces out in Afghanistan increased on a regular basis, and you were dealing with endless apparent increases, which must have made life exceedingly challenging, to say the least.
It was challenging. I would start by talking about the original deployment to Kabul, Op Fingal. So just after 9/11, there was a lot of activity in the US and the UK around what should be done to counter the Al Qaeda threat. And the decision was made very early on to go into Afghanistan to root out where Al Qaeda was based.
Yeah.
In addition to that, there was a decision made to put in a military component to be seen to be supporting Hamid Karzai, who was the new president, and that individual was chosen as General John McCall, who at the time was commanding 3rd Division, and I was part of 3rd Division. I was commander log support in 3rd Division, and if I remember correctly, John went out in November, and what we needed to do rapidly after that was to plan for a NATO deployment, a NATO-led deployment, which he would lead into Kabul. And that comprised 9 nations who put their hands up, said, yeah, we'll go. We then had to work out how we would do this, because this was the first time that NATO had done a significant operation beyond the European borders. And as I said, this was an operation that was a long way from what you would normally have as logistic infrastructure, would be a seaport or two. So we did a lot of planning, and I remember sitting in Bulford, our divisional headquarters, with the Deputy Chief of Staff, working through what we thought the logistic plan would look like. We had a number of C-130 aircraft allocated to us, which we knew we'd have to run from Oman, northern Oman, and we knew that the turnaround time was 4 3/4 hours there, 4 3/4 hours back. And we knew that we could carry 6 tons in the back of each of those C-130s. And we worked out that we had a 90-day mission, which General John McCall was leading, and we worked out it would take us 106 days to get all the people and all the equipment there. We were confident that the mission would run beyond 90 days, but it illustrated to us the magnitude of the challenge of trying to deploy and then sustain an operation so far from a seaport. When we first got there, which was, I think, on New Year's Day 2002, the main runway in Kabul airport was cratered with 6 evenly spaced craters that the Americans had done in previous years. So we were having to rely on being able to fly in on the taxiway in Kabul airport, which limited the size of the aircraft that you could fly in.
Yeah.
So one of the priority tasks was to get the airfield, Kabul airport, open and operating again. And at that stage, it still hadn't been cleared of booby traps and mines and other debris from the war as for the previous war, where the Northern Alliance, inspired by the Americans, had driven out the Taliban from Kabul. So just clearing Kabul airport, repairing the runway, so that we could at least get some heavy lift aircraft in there was a huge task. The other challenge was sustainment needs a lot of volume, so you can't carry it all in an aeroplane. So we had to find a way of getting stuff over land, and the nearest port to do that was Karachi. The Pakistanis were loath to have foreign military people for their own domestic and military and security reasons in country. So we had to find a way of contracting to get the support into Kabul. So we had to find a food contractor, we had to find a fuel contractor, we had to find all the providers of stuff that we then have to take the risk of running up the 1,100 kilometres, getting across the border into Afghanistan, and then getting it to us in Kabul. And we eventually did that. It was quite a challenge, but we eventually did that. We also, at the time, had to set up a forward mounting base for NATO because the UK was looking to hand over command of that operation, what eventually became the 6-month point. So I came out of Kabul, took a job as the UK's Joint Force Logistic Component Commander. So in addition to running the UK forward mounting base in Oman, we were setting up a forward mounting base that NATO would take on in Pakistan. So that was just the start of it. We then went down to Helmand, which was another set of
felt, just to interrupt for a second, you must have felt that a 90-day deployment into Afghanistan was naive in the extreme. Our British history tells us that we don't have a very good story to tell about Afghanistan. Others don't either. And to imagine that we could get away with a 90-day deployment was unlikely, to say the least.
I think as initially envisaged, where it would be a deployment to Kabul, there will be visible multinational support to Hamid Karzai, and the military boundary of that operation just being Kabul. That to my mind was militarily achievable. And we knew that we could sustain that because there were no armoured vehicles, or very few armoured vehicles. There were very few vehicles. So in military terms, it was a light scale operation, and it was about small arms ammunition. It was about fuel. It was about rations and so on.
Yeah.
So I felt that was doable, although it would take us time to get that set up. The expansion to Helmand, I think, was a completely different ballgame. So militarily, we were going into an area where intelligence was light, which in military planning terms, if there's a lot of uncertainty, you need a lot of reserve capability so that you can deal militarily with the uncertainty. And I didn't feel perhaps that we were as well informed in intelligence terms as we might have been.
This, of course, was 4.5 or 5 years after the initial deployment.
Yes, it was. Yeah. And so NATO had made a decision. Obviously a political decision that we needed to do more in Afghanistan to create stability in the nation. We had to do some nation building. We had to create an economy that wasn't dependent on narcotics. We had to create a governance structure that people had confidence in. We had to do more to kind of modernise society by educating more girls and women. To try to eradicate some of those conditions that are conducive to the re-emergence of terrorism. So politically, the intent, I think, was right. But militarily, it was hugely challenging with the numbers of troops that you needed to be able to create the security conditions to enable that nation building to go on. So for the UK, we initially had a manpower headcount restriction of 3,500. Now that was a political direction, militarily endorsed because we were still in Iraq at the time, and we were pretty tight for forces. So putting a number count, a head count limit on our army in particular was one way that we could manage with the size of the army in particular that we had. But what that meant was that there was a limit to what you could actually do operationally on the ground, and there was a limit to the resources that you could apply logistically to support that operation. And there were some broader constraints as well, because we were really plunging into not quite unknown but not very well known military operations in Helmand. What were the assets that were going to be needed? And we at one stage were talking about, and we did deploy Warrior. Now, Warrior as an armoured fighting vehicle comes with a big logistic chain. It's spares, it's fuel, it's all those things. How are we going to get that down there? How are we going to get the spares and the fuel to where they're actually needed if the Warrior go on, a 2-week deployment somewhere away from a base? it relied heavily on heavy lift aircraft. So C-17s, when we went to Helmand, the UK only had 2 C-17s on lease from the US. How are we going to get more heavy lift aircraft? And we eventually bought another 7 C-17s at the cost of £750 million very quickly. Thankfully, the Americans or Boeing had them on the production line. We had to ramp up the availability of Chinook aircraft, who I think, if I remember rightly, had an allocation of 30 flying hours a month per airframe. Well, we had to treble that, but we had to have the industrial capability behind us. In this case, it was Boeing, who could deliver the increase in flying hours, everything from engine components to rotor blades to all sorts of other things, some of which had a long lead time. So from a very good intent, very good kind of political and military intent to do stuff down there, the logistical implications going all the way back into the industrial base were very significant indeed. And that would have assumed that everything had gone according to plan. But of course, things don't go according to plan on military operations. So we needed to find lots of resource. And in the end, we built a logistic base. We built a base for repairing and refurbishing armoured vehicles in country, so we weren't having to fly them out. And we built a whole infrastructure there that provided a better level of support, more flexibility.
So we're on to Camp Bastion now.
We're on to Camp Bastion on steroids.
It turned out it ended up being an enormous base. I'm told
Yes.
the perimeter to this camp was 20 miles,
Yes.
or something like that.
Yes.
Enormous number of aircraft movements every day when the campaign was at its height.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk to us about Camp Bastion, because
Yeah.
it sounds an enormous undertaking.
It didn't start life as that. It started life as a small tented camp that was designed to provide a base for people who weren't deployed to the forward operating bases, and provide a base through which you could rotate some of those troops who were deployed to forward operating bases. And forgive me for not being able to remember exactly how many people it was originally designed for, but I would say it was less than 200 people. So it was a tented camp, and you will recognise what a tented camp is, 12 by 12 tents and bigger, with some camp beds, a field kitchen, some duck boards that you could walk across, and some rudimentary lighting and heating delivered by generators. Built by the Royal Engineers, maintained by the Royal Engineers. It was a tightly packed camp adjacent to an established US camp, which is Camp Leatherneck, and the thought that it made sense to co-locate there. It was well away from any urban areas, so therefore security was much easier than had it been somewhere more urban. So the camp was built. It must have been 2006, but it was immediately obvious that it would not be big enough to support the level of ambition that we had militarily. But again, because of the political and financial constraints around the operation, it was only possible to obtain the budget and the approval to make the camp bigger in 6 monthly chunks. And I don't say that in any way as criticism of the way that the MOD and the Treasury allocated funds for this. That's just the reality of the financial situation that we were in as a country at the time, heading very closely towards the financial crisis. So what most of us knew would have to be a camp that could accommodate hundreds and then thousands of people. We couldn't design it for that from the outset, because we knew we'd have to go in increments, because that was the way that the money was allocated and the budget was allocated. And there were a couple of times where there were decisions made to invest heavily in the camp. So putting a sewage main and putting a power main all around it. And the other big asset that was there as part of Camp Bastion was the airstrip, which was initially envisaged as just being a really rough strip, which would cope with C-130s coming in, doing rough tactical landings. Clearly there's an impact on the aircraft for doing too many of those. So very quickly, that rough C-130 capable strip became a much more hardened, compacted airstrip. In order to do that, of course, we had to fly in heavy plant, and the plant operators, and they needed to be sustained. We then started trying to up-spec that airfield so it would cater for C-17s. So effectively the length of the runway, I think, went from something like 600 feet to at least that, 3 times that. And there was a surface put on it such that it wouldn't trash a C-17 as it came into land. What came with that was the need to put in some proper air traffic control, have an air traffic control tower with the team that would man that, and so on and so on. And so very quickly you can see how by making even relatively small improvements in operational output, it has a very significant effect on the infrastructure that was required and based around Camp Bastion. It went from being a tented camp, as you suggest, for a couple of hundred, to being a sort of porter cabin camp with its own water purifying plant and accommodating, a small number of thousands of people within just a couple of years.
10,000?
Not quite 10,000, but quite a lot of people,
of
including
people.
Contractors.
Yeah.
Who were there, ultimately had contractors in there that were maintaining the camp and building new bits. And I say there was a water bottling plant there, run by a defence contractor, which provided fresh water for the force.
David, on the Camp Bastion operation, really, the public saw a lot of Camp Bastion in terms of the casualty evacuation process, which in these modern times became second to none and the envy of several other armies, I dare say. Do you want to say a few words about the casualty evacuation system which was developed, which made sure that our casualties survived?
Yeah, it was a remarkable system. It was a groundbreaking system that was a combination of a lot of moving parts. The first thing was the availability of Chinook helicopters with CASEVAC teams. It took time to optimise that, and clearly it's testament to some very brave RAF Chinook pilots who flew their airframes into some pretty hazardous places in order to extract casualties. So that was the first bit, and the CASEVAC teams, the medical teams that were on those helicopters, were absolutely crucial in administering the first aid that was needed to get people back to the field hospital in Camp Bastion. And the field hospital crews in Camp Bastion became hugely adept at responding really quickly and dealing with multiple casualties, not just British people but Afghans as well. And then were remarkably adept at stabilising those casualties and then getting them on a C-17 with another medical team back to the UK. And there were many stories of soldiers from point of wounding back to the Queen Elizabeth II Hospital in Birmingham, within 2 days. Some much longer because they needed longer to be stabilised. But that whole system of transportation with appropriate medical care at the right stages, I think was a remarkable system that was put together. And as you say, I think groundbreaking, world leading. The only sadness is it was so heavily exercised, certainly at some point with the casualty rates that we were experiencing. But I don't know the statistics of the numbers that were wounded and the numbers that survived. But I think as you saw the numbers of Afghan-related casualties coming home, going through the recovery phase and then the rehabilitation phase at Headley Court, you saw the horrific injuries that so many of these young men and women experienced, and the fact that so many survived, I think, is a testament to the system that was put in place. I think it's quite remarkable. The Canadians also had a very effective field hospital in Kandahar, which they ran on behalf of NATO. So there was a lot of medical, a lot of really swept up medical facilities that were developed there.
David, whilst we are talking about this, of course, this is sort of inside Camp Bastion, but of course the operation and the deployment was to dominate the area and to get people out of Camp Bastion. Now, movement around there was very difficult. We were talking earlier about the Kajaki Dam. I'm not sure how you pronounce it actually, but the movement of turbines, engines to run this dam, presumably out of Camp Bastion up to this dam, and I'm not quite sure how far it was away, but I think it was a big operation. Would you like to just say a few words about that and the security that we needed to place around this operation, which was essentially a movement of equipment from A to B?
Yeah. So when we went down to Helmand, the security situation very quickly deteriorated. So the surface movement situation. So we relied very heavily on heavy lift helicopters, but they can't carry everything, nor can they be everywhere, when you need them, or where you'd like to have them. So it was absolutely necessary to move stuff by road, and the road network was reasonable. But of course, the Taliban knew that we needed to rely on the roads and became adept at laying IEDs, improvised explosive devices. So every logistic patrol that left Camp Bastion to go and resupply Sangin or Lashkar or wherever was actually deployed as a deliberate operation, as a combat logistic patrol, usually commanded by a Royal Logistic Corps major, perhaps lieutenant colonel, and supported in classic kind of military patrol terms by some air cover, or some aviation cover helicopters, and by some armoured vehicles. And that would be a typical supply run into Sangin or Lashkar, a combat logistic patrol. And the longer we were in Helmand, the more acute the IED challenge became. And absolutely crucial to the British Army's freedom of movement, surface movement in Afghanistan, was the role played by our explosive ordnance disposal technicians, typically a staff sergeant or warrant officer, who would be part of a combat logistic patrol, and their job was to clear improvised explosive devices laid by the Taliban, and those really highly skilled, and incredibly brave individuals were really at the forefront of helping us maintain that freedom of movement. In fact, there are two that we recognise here in the museum. So Staff Sergeant Olaf Schmidt, who was posthumously awarded the George Cross for his bravery in one particularly demanding day, where I think, if I remember rightly, he was required to clear something like 11 or 12 devices on a single patrol, and was very, very sadly killed during the last one of those. And Staff Sergeant Kim Hughes was also awarded the George Cross for similar sorts of explosive device clearance operations, and the effort put in by that regiment and those individuals during that phase of Operation Helmand was absolutely immense. If we go to the Kajaki Dam operation, which, if I remember right, it was in 2008 or 2009, maybe in 2010. So the intent there was to try to reinstall turbines on the Kajaki Dam in the north of Helmand province, which had been out of use for 20 plus years, in order to restore power to some of the villages and the towns in Helmand province. So an absolutely laudable and correct military aspiration as part of a broader effort to support the country.
Absolutely.
That was a colossal military operation, a deliberate military operation, led by an RLC Lieutenant Colonel Rufus McNeill, very capable man. It was almost a brigade-size operation because of the need to put forward reconnaissance at least the day before. The convoy that was carrying these enormous turbines left Camp Bastion. There was a need to ensure that the high ground on the flanks was cleared and held.
Picketed, we might say.
Picketed, we might say, in classic movement tactics.
Yep.
The heavy lift vehicles carrying the turbines limped along at 10 miles an hour. And the whole deliberate operation, if I remember rightly, took something like 2 weeks. It was an enormous undertaking, and safely undertaken. Everyone came back in one piece. The turbines were delivered, so it was a successful operation. Arguably, it was an operational failure because, as far as I know, those turbines are still sat at the hillside, at Kajaki Dam because the security situation deteriorated such that it didn't allow the technicians to go there and fix them up so that they were actually working. So as a military aspiration, it was the right thing to do. As a logistic undertaking, it was enormous. But they didn't deliver the effect that we'd hoped that they would deliver.
No. David, if you were to do this again, what would you do differently?
Wow. So one of the principles of logistics is foresight. And foresight as a word was chosen very deliberately and carefully by those that wrote the logistics manual. Because foresight implies a little bit of knowledge about what's to come, but it also implies a certain amount of crystal ball gazing and mind reading and paranormal activity that's not normally the sort of stuff of military people. I think what I would like to do, what I would like to have seen is some of the uncertainties around the operation eliminated, a better intelligence picture. I think less military kind of gung-ho-ness, perhaps, and more political deliberation about what was the art of the possible. So an honest conversation for the military about, we can do this, but we can't do that. If you want us to do that, it needs a force structure, that's perhaps much bigger, and it needs a resource envelope that's that size. I can do that with this number of people, but I can't do that. So I think, an open and honest discussion about what's militarily feasible and logistically feasible is absolutely what's needed. And I think perhaps, on reflection, we took some wrong lessons from some of our previous deployments. So successful deployments in Sierra Leone, East Timor, logistically quite light. Logistically, we had bases from which we could operate close to the area of operations. We perhaps didn't realise the extent of the logistic stretch that would be necessary in a country that was 1,100 kilometres from the nearest seaport. We perhaps got too used to the relative ease of an ongoing operation in Iraq, where we were close to a seaport, and just underestimated the amount of effort and the difficulty of trying to sustain an operation which could have gone in many different directions so far from a strong logistic base.
Yeah. David, thank you very much. You've given us an outstanding picture of the difficulties of planning this operation. I am reminded that amateurs talk tactics and professionals study logistics. And the logistics of this operation must have been absolutely huge. We've heard a bit about that tonight, and we're very grateful to you, David. And I'm very glad we've been able to mention the various units which call Oxfordshire home. I should mention one other thing. I'd like to mention one other thing, which is that we also honour in this museum Lieutenant Colonel Rupert Thorneloe, who was killed in 2009, commanding the Welsh Guards battle group. He was a local boy around these parts, and we tell his story in the museum. That brings our talk tonight to an end, but don't go anywhere, because we're going to have a live question and answer following immediately.
The question and answer session will start shortly. The Q&A window will open below the video window. Please log in to ask a question.
Good evening and welcome to the live element of tonight's talk from Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. My name is Henry Spielberg and I'm a trustee here at the museum, and I'm delighted to welcome online our speaker from tonight, David Shouesmith, and I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank my colleague David Innes for conducting the interview that you have just seen. David Innes is out of the country at the moment, so it's my privilege to be your host for tonight's question and answer session. So, David, just before we kick off with the first few questions that have come in, I just thought I'd take the opportunity to introduce you briefly, because there wasn't much of a chance to do that earlier. So just by way of background, David Shouesmith joined the British Army in 1981 and over a 28-year career rose to the rank of Major General, operating in a variety of operational, logistics, acquisition and support appointments, and in his last 3 years in the Ministry of Defence as the Assistant Chief of Defence Staff for Logistic Operations. Prior to that, he'd completed operational tours in Bosnia and Afghanistan. And since leaving the Army, David has worked in management consulting, bringing his experience of strategy, major projects and strategic supply chain management to a wide range of companies in defence and many other sectors. He's also a director of Universal Defence and Security Solutions and was the founding chairman of the Royal Logistics Corps Foundation, and very pertinent for tonight is the current chairman of the trustees of Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. So with that little introduction done, David, are you happy to take some questions from our audience?
Very happy, Henry. Thanks very much for the introduction.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've had some really good responses from those of you watching online tonight already. Thank you very much for that positive comments. And we'll start off with the first question from Blair Southerden, who comments that the RAF has now scrapped its C-130 fleet. Does the airlift capability still exist to carry out a similar operation?
Short answer is yes. I think there are many around defence, both currently serving and like myself from the expanding retired community, who mourn the moving on of the C-130. Been in service with the RAF some 50 years, in service around the globe, an absolute workhorse. Been through a number of capability upgrades during its life, but some hard decisions needed. Ministry of Defence, where is the Ministry of Defence going to spend its budget? So the decision was made to send it out of service. What is now in the MOD, of course, is the C-17 fleet, as I mentioned in the early session. But we also have the Atlas fleet, so the A400M, which is bigger than a C-130. It's a bit like a mini C-17, but it provides some of the functionality the C-130 used to have. So Atlas A400M is well capable of doing the sort of things that the C-130 did. Less of 600-foot rough landing strip. It needs a little bit longer and a little less roughness. But in terms of physical capacity to lift range, it certainly is well capable of doing that. And the other thing that the MOD has, of course, is Chinook. It has a lot of Chinook. It's looking at the extended range version of Chinook to be able to do some of the stuff perhaps closer to where the military action is than you could get with the C-130 and certainly could get with the A400M. So I think a combination of C-17, A400M, and extended range Chinook does allow the military to do the same sort of reach that it had when it had the C-130 fleet. Not in the same way, but in a different combination and use of assets.
Yeah. Thank you. Interesting. So different resources, but not necessarily lesser resources.
I think, I mean, you could argue, I mean, it depends how you want to do the maths and the load planning, but you could argue that there's, substantially more lift power or lift capacity in that combination of resources than we had. And I go back to my, it's now nearly 20 years, but, we started the Afghan campaign with just 2 C-17s on a lease. And we were very lucky that we were able to pull another 7 off the production line at Boeing to take us up to the number that we still have. We committed to that operation, arguably, with inadequate strategic lift resources. Well, we have many more strategic lift resources now than we had for that operation. So pretty confident we can provide the capacity that's needed. Or the MOD, the MOD can provide the capacity that's needed when it's needed.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. And in a way, the next question builds on that, but I think takes it beyond just the air capability. Question from Simon Booth Mason. Thank you, Simon. Who just asks, quite simply, could we do this all again on today's resources?
It depends what else we're doing, of course. There's a great cry throughout the decades of concurrency, operational concurrency in MOD. If we weren't doing too much else, then I'm pretty sure we could do it again. But it's perhaps misleading to make a direct comparison. We've spoken about the airlift. Absolutely, the airlift is there, both strategically and tactically. If you used as a rule of thumb the number of soldiers, Marines and airmen, women that were deployed at the peak, it was in excess of 3,500, often more than that. Could we find 3,500 people on a rotation basis to deploy in an operation? I'm pretty sure the Army could find that, the MOD could find that, subject to what else is going on. I think, we all know there's a lot of controversy around the size of the Army at the moment, money spent on defence and commitments, and the need to, prepare for the being in a pre-conflict phase, as Mark Chapter said. I think the issue is perhaps not so much about military capacity as around the politics of deploying again on an operation like this, which was fundamentally a war of choice, coming off the back of a series of operations, some successful, some less so. So, as I said in the earlier session, we went to East Timor, we went to Sierra Leone, successful operations at small scale. We went to Iraq, which was initially a military success, turned out to be politically challenging thereafter. And Afghanistan, will receive mixed reviews, the extent to which it was a military success or not. So I think this is more about the appetite of the nation and politicians to commit to a war of choice, because that commitment to war of choice implies that it comes with the level of resourcing that's required to make something a military success. And these types of operations, like any military operation, is only ever successful if there's a political solution in the backdrop. So in the case of Afghanistan, this was about a stable, preferably democratically elected government, providing prosperity, education, and so on and so forth. If it was Iraq, it was about political stability. If it's Ukraine, it's about political stability. There's got to be a political solution here. So whilst the military will always be straining at the leash to be deployed somewhere, what we have to have by way of balance is a political will to make sure that what we go and do is militarily achievable, but more importantly, within the context of a broad political settlement solution plan that delivers the enduring stability that's needed.
Yes. Well, comment just come in saying that there needs to be political will to fund it. So I guess it goes far beyond purely military objectives. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if you look back in history, certainly I remember when I was learning all about counterinsurgency doctrine, it was kind of written in the late 40s, the 50s, and the early 60s. The banner headline always when you were going through this sort of education was, there is no military solution. There has to be a political solution. So whatever military adventure is out there has got to be within the context of political intent of whichever, whoever the protagonists are. Yeah. Thank you, David. Great answer. We'll pause just for a moment there to say that we're very grateful for tonight's sponsors, Beard Construction. Hopefully you saw their presentation at the start of the talk. Very grateful for their support indeed, and we're also very grateful for your support online. If you have enjoyed tonight's talk and you're enjoying the discussion, please don't forget you can donate right now. You can either donate by clicking on the link on your screen now, or you can also donate by text. You just need to text the word logistics followed by the amount of your donation, and text that to 70450, and your text will cost the donation amount plus your standard message rate. And we're very grateful for any donations that you can offer. As those of you who are supporters of the museum will know, we're a totally unfunded museum. We don't receive any direct grants at all, so we're entirely reliant on your generosity to allow us to continue telling the military story of Oxfordshire, and we're really very grateful for your ongoing support. David, another question which has come from somebody who I think is known quite well to both of us, Mike Montague. Thanks, Mike, who comments, it's a fascinating discussion, an amazing generation of logistic capabilities from a near standing start, as you outlined. He asks, have some of the capabilities survived as a legacy, or was this operation too much of a one-off?
Well, I think we generated the forces for both the first phase of Afghanistan and then the move to Helmand province from the Orbat. Although the army was the principal or the lead component, because of the numbers and the nature of the operation, the level of support from the Air Force in terms of support helicopter fleet, in terms of C-130, in terms of C-17 was substantial. So those assets existed eventually, and I mentioned earlier that it was kind of a frame of mind and an approach that we had to make best use of those assets that were available. We had to acquire some more C-17s, and the money was found to do that. But increasing the number of flying hours on Chinook, for example, effectively trebled the availability of those assets. So this is as much about making best use of the assets that are available as it is about bemoaning the shortfalls. And I think that will always be the case in any military operation. And I don't want to sit here bemoaning the unfortunate victimhood of the military logistician. We plan, we train, we create capabilities, we put in place support plans across all three services. And then when the signals come to go and deploy on a new operation, it's always a bit different to that which you plan for. So there's always an element of improvisation and making the best of what we have. And that will be true for the next operation that we go on. One might reflect on, Mike, you will have been around long enough to remember when we have 4 divisions in Germany, and our whole orientation as a Germany was against the Soviet threat. Our force structures, our capabilities, all our equipment, everything was really prioritized to face off against that threat. And you'll have seen the coverage in the press as much as I have, and the discussions that you have with current and serving people about the pressure on defence to reorientate itself to that sort of threat. If you go back to 1914, if you go back to 1938, we were ill prepared for those 2 major operations. I'm not saying that we're necessarily going to be ill prepared for the next one. I'm merely making the point that an element of improvisation is always going to be apparent in any new military operation that we undergo. I think the important thing is to learn the lessons. And I have to say, UK, I would comment this as a personal view. The UK has learnt the lessons of history, or at least had to experience the lessons of history on a number of occasions. 1914, 1939, and we did it again. Had to relearn some of these things again in Iraq, and when we went to Afghanistan. So you have to have people who kind of lived the experience with the equipment that you've got to really embed the lessons of it.
Yeah, thank you. As you've suggested, taking a long view, looking back can be helpful, because I think it's fair to say Britain historically has never had a large standing army. It's not like the continental armies, we've always had a small army, so we've had to be nimble and creative and imaginative with the resources available at the time.
Yeah, it's absolutely been the case, and our kind of defence policy over the centuries has waxed and waned. A maritime nation, maritime trading routes, absolutely. We see that now, the necessity for that now. what's going in the Gulf, and then stuff blows up in Europe, and suddenly we have to mobilise for a mainland European continental conflict at the same time as maintaining our trade routes and our maritime strength, which requires not just ships, of course, but air power. So, there are some tides of history that it's worth remembering here. One of the characteristics, if you like, of us being a mature democracy is that at the earliest opportunity, we don't spend money on defence; we spend it on schools and hospitals. Thank goodness we do that. It just means that we're then the next operation that comes, next campaign that comes, next military campaign, we are tending to have to improvise and adapt until such time as we sort of catch up militarily. So we hope for whatever the next campaign might be that we have time to catch up, to restock our warehouses and rebuild our armoured vehicle fleet, an aircraft fleet, and so on and so forth. Yeah, it's a characteristic of our democracy. I'm not criticising it's the way it is now. So.
Thank you. A comment from Doug McMillan, which in fact links into a question I was thinking of developing myself. So it says, the Hearts and Minds, we failed. I think it's a view. Would Rory Stewart, for example, agree with regard to Afghanistan in that? And the question I was leading up to ask was, you mentioned a bit about nation building as one of the primary objectives of being in Afghanistan in the first place, trying to move the economy away from being dependent on narcotics and so on, educating and so on. How do you feel? Did you feel prepared to have that sort of role, as well as the, if you like, purely logistical focus of your original deployment there?
I think what we took on was immensely challenging, and I referred previously to the original deployment in 2002. Kabul, provide visible security and provide visible multinational commitment to Karzai. Once the NATO decision was made to expand not just into Helmand, but we also went to Kandahar, went into Herat, NATO deployed force elements to all the Afghan provinces. Once that decision was made, against the backdrop of how do you stop the conditions for terrorism being recreated? So the logic says, well, you've got to create, governance that's trusted by everybody. You've got to create an economy and livelihoods. You've got to create an education system that everybody can go through, and therefore will not have to recourse to an intensely rural and impoverished society. So the ambition, is absolutely right, but the joining of the dots between the nation building ambition and the resources available to do it was where the thing came unstuck. People committed billions of pounds and dollars, but the governance infrastructure was never strong enough. Money was never enough. How much money would be enough? I don't know. But the nation building resources that need to go into somewhere like Afghanistan, if we wanted those sort of outcomes, far outweigh the political and the political patience that's needed to be able to do those things. And I think as we came out 18 months or so ago, that sort of feeling was evident. And I suppose my comment would be that the military are always kind of forward-leaning and always, eager to do things, particularly new things. And it needs a sound kind of political leadership to be able to ask those questions about, well, what happens if, and if for this type of operation, the kind of wider governmental resources and commitment don't exist, then we shouldn't go in and seek a military-only solution. That's a lesson of history. But equally, I understand the imperative. If you want to eradicate terrorism that originates in an intensely rural society, then you have to take away those causes. And those causes are around prosperity, governance, and so on and so forth. And so again, the logic is right, but the resource portfolio and the resource envelope and the strategic kind of political patience are the things that are even more challenging than a military campaign.
Yes, and I think we're coming back to the point again that ultimately the solution can't be military, or not purely military. It's
No.
that means to an end. We've had a comment and question, in fact, from Mark Beard. So, Mark, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you once again for your very valued support of tonight's talk. And thanks for getting in touch. Mark says, tremendous presentation, follow-up comments. What special skills, he asks, do you feel those involved in logistics, the logistics operation in Afghanistan, have developed that could be used within UK businesses and the wider community?
Wow. I'd almost turn that one around, Mark. There are some. We'll come back and answer the question, but I'll just give you a slightly different perspective. So from my point of view, I always looked to find where is the repository of expertise that the military can make best use of. Is that expertise best embedded in uniformed people, or actually does it sit outside the barbed wire in industry? I think if you're dodging bombs and bullets and you're firing back and you're doing all those sorts of things, then those skills really ought to be found just in the military. If you're digging holes and wiring up electricity mains, if you're driving trucks, if you're accounting for stores, if you're repairing vehicles, if you're a wizard in the digital environment, there is a strong argument that says that most of those skills and the really top end of those skills sits outside the barbed wire, sits in industry. So the challenge is almost how do you, in the military, access that range of expertise that perhaps in times past did reside in the military. So, you know, at the end of the Second World War, we had how many people we had in uniform. You know, we could do logistics in industrial scale, but it was all done with clipboards and pencils and trucks and, you know, warehouses. You know, those days are long gone. And expertise sits in, you know, Amazon, it sits in Gunnahnagel, it sits in, you know, all sorts of other logistic providers, just as, you know, the Amazons of this world, the Microsofts of this world, the Metas of this world are at the cutting edge of what we do digitally. So our challenge in the military is how do we access those skills? How do we bring them into a military operation in a way that's affordable, that's timely, that's robust, that's reliable? And those are some of the challenges that the MOD is facing at the moment. And of course, with, you know, an ever tightening defence budget, ways of finding more efficient ways to do things, as well as more effective ways to do things, are the challenge that the MOD has got. I think the military lessons are pretty enduring. It's about being able to do these things in high threat environments, perhaps with rudimentary equipment, or perhaps with kit that, you know, isn't actually suited to the job, but you're going to have to find a way to make it happen anyway. So I think it's relearning old lessons. It's not so much about the specific skills, but it's about, you know, the reality of being in the middle of nowhere with just the shovel or just the little bulldozer, 6 tons coming out of the back of the C-130, and then trying to make a difference with the stuff that you've got.
Thank you. Well, hopefully that's given Mark some food for thought as well. That's great. So we're getting towards the end of our time this evening. Thank you ever so much, all of you watching, for your engagement, for your questions and comments, and I hope you've enjoyed it all so far. Just some notes about some things that are happening at the museum, and in fact, David, you might want to comment on this. As Ursula said in her introduction at the beginning, 2024 is a very significant year for SOFO because it's our 10th anniversary, which is very exciting. And of course, it's also a very big anniversary very significant for Oxfordshire as a county. It's the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and of course all the events of 1944 in which troops from Oxfordshire played a very significant part. So, David, do you want to just mention some of the activities that we've got in our programme coming up over the next few months?
Thanks, Henry. You've probably heard enough of my voice for now, so I'll be very quick. It is the 10th anniversary of SOFPO. As Henry said, we've got sort of programme events running through the year, really kick off in the spring. We've got a bit of a press launch happening in April. We're planning a garden party for the 22nd of June, all welcome. And there'll be a number of sort of events associated with that garden party. We've got a band concert in November. But what we're trying to do as part of this celebrating the 10th anniversary it is unashamedly piggyback on the opportunity that the 80th anniversary of D-Day gives us. And what we're trying to do is capture as many stories as we can of the period around D-Day and how it affected the county. So, memories from 4-year-olds of aeroplanes flying overhead, memories of people seeing Americans camped in the field next to their farm. In addition to the spectacular stories such as Box and Bucks Light Infantry at Pegasus Bridge, we want to capture the stories of ordinary people in the county in that period immediately before and after D-Day. So we've got some of those already. We've asked for some more. If any of you have any stories at all that you could relate to that you think we might be interested in, please get in touch. But we'll be planning to put these together and have this as part of our display, both in the museum and during the garden party. And it's a really important part of what we do as a museum to reflect the experiences of the wider community, not just the military, as they also live through conflict. So those Oxfordshire stories are really important to us. And the last thing, and please, I won't ask for your forgiveness for banging this drum. Any donations that you may wish to make will be gratefully received. As Henry said, we are a privately funded museum. We survive on donations in order to keep doing what we're doing this evening. And for our plans for our 10th anniversary, we do need the support of you and the public. So please feel free to donate and spread the word. Thanks very much, Henry.
Excellent. Thanks, David. And I think it's probably worth just reminding people, if you're not already aware, you can sign up to join the museum mailing list. It's very easy to do. You just need to provide an email, and then that's a great way of making sure that you hear all the news first. You keep informed about all the events and activities that are happening, and make sure that you're among the first to know when things are announced. So that's just a link on the museum website. In fact, I think there's even a link when you join the talk as well. So do please sign up for that. I just wanted to state this is the 25th in our continuing series of online talks, which is quite a milestone in itself. They started during the pandemic and continued ever since. And we're very grateful to all of our speakers who've been happy to present to us on a very wide range of topics, ranging from Battle of Agincourt through to Ian Fleming and James Bond, stories of escape from Colwitz, and all of the talks are still available to watch free of charge on the museum website. So just follow the links to the online talks. And we hope that you will join us for our next talk, which is taking place on Saturday, the 9th of March, so 3 weeks' time. And it's a pretty exciting one because we have a fabulous interview with Garth Ennis, who may well be known to people watching as a renowned comic book writer. And this is in conjunction with our ongoing current exhibition at the museum called Into Battle, which is the art of British war comics. So looking at over a century of war comics, which of course have brought pleasure to so many people over many years and continue to be of interest now. So it's an incredible coup really for the museum to have secured this opportunity to live stream broadcast the interview with Garth Ennis, and it should be very, very interesting. He will be talking about his 3 decades career as a comic book writer, the influence that war comics had on him as as he developed as a writer. Of course, he's still involved very much now in creating comic book stories. So that should be very interesting indeed. And as with this talk, there'll be a live Q&A afterwards. So please do join us on the 9th of March. That will be a very special event. Please do tell your friends as well, and spread the word as widely as possible. We think this one's going to be extremely popular. But just back to tonight for now. I shall bring proceedings to a close by thanking once again our speaker tonight, David Shouesmith, for your insight and expertise. We've all enjoyed it very much indeed. Thank you to David Innes as well for conducting the interview with you, and also to our technical expert, Clive Smith, who makes sure that everything works properly and that the live stream goes ahead. Thanks once again to Mark Beard and everybody at Beard Construction for your invaluable support and sponsorship for tonight's talk. It's very much appreciated. And finally, thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight, and also hopefully those of you who'll be watching on catch up once the talk is available on the museum site from tomorrow. So, but for now, from David and myself and all of us at the museum, thank you very much for watching, and good night.
Thank you.